There is a certain kind of person who is remarkably easy to underestimate and surprisingly difficult to understand. They walk into a room without trying to become its center, even when they may see more than anyone inside it. They do not advertise every conclusion, correct every mistake, or turn every conversation into a demonstration of what they know. Sometimes they hesitate before answering, lose interest in shallow competition, or remain silent while louder people collect the credit. Most observers look at this and see something simple: insecurity, passivity, awkwardness, or a lack of ambition. Because we have been trained to recognize intelligence through speed, confidence, credentials, vocabulary, and visible achievement. But psychology offers a more complicated picture of what a powerful mind can look like in ordinary life. Intelligence is not only the ability to produce the right answer before everyone else reaches it. It can also appear as restraint, curiosity, mental flexibility, pattern recognition, and an unusual awareness of what remains unknown. What looks like overthinking from the outside may sometimes be a mind refusing to accept an explanation that does not survive deeper inspection. Today, we are going to decode 9 signs that you may be far more intelligent than the people around you realize, not to hand out a flattering label, but to understand why genuine thinking is so often confused with uncertainty or weakness. Some of these signs may feel familiar, while others may completely change how you interpret qualities you have spent years trying to hide. And the 9th sign, the one we will end with, explains why the most capable thinker in a room may never look impressive at first. It reveals that intelligence is not merely about having thoughts, but about being able to observe, test, and correct the mind producing them. Before we begin, however, we need to separate psychological signals from comforting myths. No collection of habits can measure your intelligence, and no video can replace a properly designed assessment interpreted in context. Being quiet does not automatically make someone brilliant, just as being confident does not automatically make someone shallow. But when several of these patterns repeatedly appear together, they can reveal a depth of processing that casual observers consistently miss. The world rewards minds that display themselves quickly, even though some of the strongest minds are busy checking what everyone else rushed past. Sign 1, you notice the details that quietly change the whole picture. This is often the first sign, and it can make everyday situations far more mentally demanding than other people understand. While others hear the main point, you notice the contradiction between the words, the timing, the incentives, and the behavior surrounding them. You may enter a meeting and immediately sense which problem is being discussed and which more important problem everyone is carefully avoiding. You do not merely collect facts, because your mind automatically searches for relationships, exceptions, missing variables, and hidden causes. Cognitive researchers often distinguish simple information storage from reasoning, which requires seeing how separate pieces constrain one another. That is why you may struggle to give a quick opinion when several explanations remain possible and the available evidence is incomplete. To someone waiting for certainty, your caution can look like confusion, even when it comes from seeing more possibilities than they do. You are not always the first person to react, but you are often the first to notice why the obvious solution will create another problem later. The disadvantage is that small inconsistencies can stay in your mind long after everyone else has comfortably moved on. The advantage is that when the surface story collapses, you have usually been studying the structure underneath it all along. Sign 2. You ask questions that sound simple but expose weak foundations. Intelligent people are not defined only by the answers they can produce, but by the assumptions they know how to examine. You may ask what a word actually means, how a conclusion was reached, or what evidence would prove the group wrong. These questions can frustrate people because they interrupt the comforting momentum of an idea that everyone has already agreed to accept. From the outside, it may appear that you are being difficult, literal, skeptical, or deliberately slowing down the conversation. But your mind is testing the load-bearing beams before allowing an entire argument to be built on top of them. This resembles first principles reasoning, the practice of reducing a claim to its basic components instead of inheriting its assumptions intact. You are less interested in whether an idea sounds familiar than in whether its internal logic actually holds together. Sometimes one precise question from you does more useful work than 20 confident statements from everyone else in the room. The people who misunderstand you hear resistance, while the people who think carefully recognize an attempt to protect the truth from convenience. You are not questioning everything because nothing matters. but because important conclusions deserve stronger foundations than social agreement. Sign 3. You pause before speaking because your mind is rejecting its first answer. Modern culture often treats rapid responses as evidence of intelligence, and hesitation as evidence that someone has nothing valuable to say. Yet many reasoning errors occur precisely because the mind accepts the first explanation that feels fluent, familiar, or emotionally satisfying. Your pause may be the moment in which you test an instinct, search for counterexamples, and separate what you know from what you assume. Psychologists sometimes describe this capacity as cognitive reflection, the ability to resist an attractive immediate answer and examine it further. This does not mean every slow response is wise, because confusion and inattention can also delay an answer. But when your silence contains active comparison, revision, and error checking, it is not empty space at all. It is mental work happening before language, where nobody else can see it, and therefore nobody thinks to reward it. By the time you speak, the conversation may have moved forward, and a more confident person may already own the room. Still, your answer often has a durability that faster opinions lack, because it has already survived an argument inside your own head. You are not always slow because you cannot keep up, but because you refuse to confuse speed with accuracy. Sign 4. You can make a difficult idea feel surprisingly simple. People often mistake complicated language for complicated thought, even though the two are not the same thing. Anyone can hide uncertainty behind jargon, long explanations, and references that the audience is unlikely to challenge. Real understanding is revealed when you can identify the essential structure of an idea without destroying the truth that makes it useful. You naturally search for the example, comparison, or image that allows another person to see what you already see. This requires more than memory, because you must understand both the subject and the mind of the person receiving it. You have to decide which details are essential, which can wait, and which explanation will transfer, rather than merely impress. That process is a form of cognitive compression, turning complexity into clarity without turning it into distortion. The result may sound so obvious that people underestimate the thinking required to produce it. They see a short explanation and assume the idea was simple, never noticing how much confusion you removed before speaking. One of the quietest forms of intelligence is making other people feel capable instead of making yourself look superior. Sign 5. You change your mind without experiencing it as a personal defeat. This may be one of the rarest signs because most people do not hold beliefs as information alone. They attach beliefs to identity, loyalty, status, and the private need to remain consistent in front of other people. When evidence threatens the belief, it can therefore feel as though the evidence is threatening the person. But you are capable of treating your conclusions as working models rather than permanent declarations of who you are. When stronger information appears, you update the model, because accuracy matters more to you than defending an outdated version of yourself. Psychology connects this habit with cognitive flexibility and intellectual humility, two qualities that help thinking remain responsive to reality. From the outside, your willingness to revise can be misread as inconsistency, indecision, or a lack of conviction. In reality, refusing to change would be easier because it would protect your pride and save you from explaining the correction. The phrase, "I was wrong," does not reduce your intelligence when it is followed by a better account of what the evidence shows. It reveals that your mind is loyal to learning, even when your ego would prefer a different conclusion. Sign 6. You connect ideas that other people keep in separate boxes. You may be discussing a relationship and suddenly recognize the same feedback loop you once encountered in economics, biology, or game design. To other people, the connection can initially sound random because they are comparing topics while you are comparing the relationships inside them. Psychologists call this analogical reasoning, the ability to recognize a shared structure across situations, with very different surface features. It is one of the mechanisms that allows knowledge from one domain to solve a problem in another. Your mind does not store every experience as an isolated event, because it keeps asking where else the same pattern has appeared. This is why your interests may seem scattered even though, from your perspective, they are connected by questions nobody else can see. The downside is that explaining the entire bridge between two ideas may take longer than the conversation allows, so you shorten the connection, watch confusion appear on someone's face, and sometimes decide it is easier to say nothing. But original insight often begins exactly this way, when a boundary that organizes everyone else's thinking fails to contain yours. What looks like an unusual leap may actually be the result of a mind carrying the same structure across a wider landscape. Sign 7. You are less certain of your intelligence than other people expect. This sign is frequently romanticized, so we need to handle it with precision rather than turning every insecurity into hidden genius. Self-doubt can come from anxiety, criticism, trauma, perfectionism, or environments that repeatedly taught a capable person to distrust themselves. But there is also a distinctly intellectual reason that deeper thinkers sometimes sound less certain than shallow ones. The more carefully you understand a subject, the more exceptions, boundary conditions, unknowns, and competing interpretations become visible. Your knowledge does not simply expand the area you can explain, because it also expands the border touching what you cannot yet explain. As a result, you may compare your private uncertainty with someone else's public confidence and conclude that they must understand more. You do not see the missing questions in their mind, just as they do not see the careful revisions occurring inside yours. Healthy intellectual humility means calibrating confidence to evidence, not automatically assuming that everyone else is more capable. If you constantly erase your own judgment, that is not wisdom, because accurate thinking must also recognize evidence of its own competence. Sometimes the lesson is not to become louder, but to stop treating your awareness of complexity as proof that you are inadequate. Sign 8. You need solitude, because your best thinking continues after the conversation ends. For some people, an idea disappears when the meeting finishes, the book closes, or everyone agrees to move on. For you, that may be the moment the real processing begins, because the external noise has finally stopped directing your attention. In solitude, you replay the argument, reorganize its pieces, notice what was missing, and connect it to older questions still living in memory. This does not automatically mean you dislike people, lack social ability, or believe your inner world is more important than everyone else's. It means sustained thought often requires protection from interruption, performance, and the constant demand to respond before you are ready. The mind needs periods in which it can follow an idea beyond usefulness, beyond approval, and beyond the point where conversation usually turns away. That is often where original conclusions appear, not as sudden magic, but as the delayed result of uninterrupted mental integration. Of course, solitude can become avoidance, and isolation can distort thinking when no outside evidence is allowed to enter. The intelligent use of solitude is not hiding forever, but returning with a clearer model that can survive contact with other minds. You do not withdraw because you have nothing to contribute, but because some contributions need silence before they can take shape. Sign 9. You watch your own mind while it is thinking. This is the final sign, and it changes the meaning of almost everything that came before it. Most people experience a thought as though the mere appearance of that thought makes it trustworthy, important, and entirely their own. But you can step back and ask where an idea came from, what emotion is strengthening it, and which evidence you may be ignoring. Psychology calls this metacognition, the capacity to monitor and sometimes regulate the processes by which the mind learns, judges, and decides. Metacognition does not make you immune to bias, because nobody can stand completely outside the machinery of their own perception. What it gives you is a better chance of detecting the machinery before it quietly turns a preference into a fact. You notice when anger is simplifying another person, when fear is exaggerating a risk, or when pride is protecting a weak conclusion. You may still make the mistake, but part of your mind remains available to examine, revise, and learn from it afterward. This is why your intelligence may remain invisible. Self-correction looks less dramatic than certainty, even though it produces better judgment over time. The deepest intelligence is not a mind that never fails, but a mind that becomes increasingly difficult for its own failures to deceive. When we place all 9 signs together, a different picture of intelligence begins to emerge. The person who notices contradictions looks negative, the person who asks foundational questions looks difficult, and the reflective person looks slow. The clear explainer sounds ordinary, the flexible thinker looks inconsistent, and the analogical thinker sometimes sounds strangely off-topic. The humble person appears unsure, the solitary person appears distant, and the metacognitive person may spend more time correcting than performing. None of these qualities proves a high score, And intelligence itself includes abilities that a single test or social stereotype may fail to capture. Language, education, culture, anxiety, disability, opportunity, and status all influence whether ability becomes visible and whether other people reward it. That is the missing truth behind being more intelligent than people realize. Recognition depends partly on the observer and the environment. Your mind may not be failing to demonstrate intelligence because the room may be measuring confidence, conformity, or speed instead. The goal is not to convince yourself that every difficulty is evidence of hidden brilliance, but to recognize strengths you can test through real work. If these signs described you, leave a comment with the one that finally gave language to something other people often misunderstand. I am Turn Wiser, and remember that the strongest mind is not the one that appears certain, but the one that keeps becoming more accurate.